So the thing with Google, who is rapidly emerging as, again, one of the leading hyperscale providers, I think it's mind-boggling that Google itself supports 9 separate platforms with over 1 billion users every day. I mean, it's, again, it's Android, it's Gmail, it's search, it's YouTube, photos, etc. It's mind-boggling, and that's why so many organizations want to know what they're doing. And right now, for the next 30, 40 minutes, we'll hear from Jamie to give you some insights on what GCP, the Google Cloud Platform, is up to. All yours, Jamie. I'm going to turn off my camera now and microphone, and thanks again for participating.
Yeah, thanks again for having me, Ron. And Shiva, thanks for the great lead in. What Haiku is capitalizing on is the fact that multi-cloud and hybrid cloud is a reality. And when you look at all of these hyperscale providers and you look at all of these, all of the different platforms you can put in your data centers now to have different kinds of on-prem solutions, they're all designed to excel at something a little bit differently. GCP, we really lean into the things that enable us to have all of those giant services, to enable us to deliver Gmail to billions of users every day, and YouTube, and what is, I think the latest number is something like 500 hours of video is uploaded to YouTube every minute of every day. And we wouldn't be able to do that without the machine learning and the AI tooling behind the scenes to make those good decisions for us. There aren't enough engineers on the planet to handle that process manually. So we really lean into AI, and VMware leans into its things, and AWS leans into its things. And asking a customer to only pick one of those and to make those trade-off decisions is not, it was the reality a few years ago, but it's not the reality today. And Haiku is one of those startups, one of those young companies that is making it practical. And that's what Anthos is all about. And we're going to talk primarily about Anthos today, but you can't talk about Anthos without talking about GCP. And I apologize for putting digital transformation on a slide. Didn't know what else to call it. And I hate that term, but it is what we're talking about. It's taking the technology that runs the planet that's been created over the past 20, 30, 40, 70 years, if you look at the IRS here in America, and bringing it into an existence, in a cloud or in an interconnected series of clouds that lets it exist for the next 20 or 30 years. So we really are transforming the digital presence of really the entire planet. So, and I say that, and there's the world's largest retailer. At a previous employer, I got to go work with the largest retailer on the planet, and you fly into this tiny little airport in the southern US, and you go to these giant buildings. And I mentioned something that you're this massive retailer, and they stopped what they were doing and they looked at me and said, no, we're a data analysis company, and we happen to sell things to generate data to analyze. Every industry is an IT industry now. And I was at a customer site. I got to visit a customer in person yesterday for the first time in 20 months. And one of the things they told me was, we're in this industry, but we're an analytics company increasingly every day. That's the way the world is going. Technology is becoming the table stakes. The analysis of the data is really where the world is going. So everyone's an IT shop.
Hey, Jamie?
Yeah.
One other thing too, when you listen to the reports from Moderna, which developed one of the vaccines, and you listen to their CEO, he says, we are not a biotech or medical or pharmaceutical company. We are a technology company who uses our technology platform to create vaccines.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's exactly right. It has source code, for goodness sake. Yeah. The COVID vaccine has source code. Yeah. We're at that level of human development, and to hear that coming from C-suites of companies as large as Moderna, as large as this giant retailer that I will not name, it's just kind of stunning that that's where we are. But here we are, and here's some statistics to really bear that out. And how do you get there? I was at a customer yesterday, and as I try to color everything through my most recent conversations. And one of the things we talked about was as you get into those analytics, as you figure out where to put funding, as you figure out where to put your money, you have to get to peak performance. And then before you get to peak performance, you have to define peak performance, and you have to figure out, what do I look like as I become an analytics company that fulfills my mission and then drives that analysis for my industry. I think about the old Star Wars quote. The original Star Wars movies back in the 70s, they talk about them being the biggest budget, low budget movies ever made, because George Lucas was obsessed with putting every dollar on the screen. They were an incredibly slim shop, but every dollar went into special effects. The best explosions, the best computer, the best models, the best special effects. And Luke Skywalker is wearing a pair of bleached Levi's. They put every dollar into the screen. They put every dollar where they thought they were going to fulfill their mission the best. And well, that's one of the most successful movie franchises in history. And every company has to have that decision. You have to figure out what peak performance looks like, and then you have to drive relentlessly to get to that peak performance. Once you've defined it, you have to put all your dollars on the screen. You have to put your dollars where they do the most benefit. And that's really what hybrid cloud and multi-cloud solutions are about. You don't have to decide, oh, I'm going to put my workloads in Amazon and it's going to be great for workloads 1 and 2, but workload 3 is going to cost me more money because of the way Amazon designed this service. Or I'm going to put it in GCP, but GCP doesn't do it exactly the way I want to do it to fulfill my mission. So it's going to cost me more money, or it's going to be slower for my end users. You don't have to make those decisions anymore. And that's what we have Anthos for. And then, like Ron said, this little pop-up, nobody understands scaling like Google. And that's a factual statement. I'm helping design a product that's going to GA later this fall in Q3 or early Q4. And watching the engineers design this thing to start at millions of users has been an incredible learning experience. Nobody understands scaling the way Google scales. We design everything. We start at millions and we move north of there. And that colors the way we deliver Google Cloud. That colors the way we design solutions, because we want that scaling issue for our customers to be a non-event. It scales. Done. And that's one of the things we excel at in GCP. So what does peak performance look like? And these numbers amazingly are data based. This is coming out of DORA, the DevOps Research and Analysis Project. This is coming out of a product called Camp that we actually can walk customers through, where you do some introspection and you do some analysis on how good are we at delivering software. And then we provide some best practices that are, built up over, dozens of state of DevOps reports and mountains of data analysis. This data is built in facts. Elite performers, so teams that are doing DevOps really effectively, deliver code 208 times more frequently than someone who's not. And 208 just sounds like a silly number until you start thinking, until you start mapping it. And someone who's not very far along the DevOps journey, who's not very effective in delivering software using modern methodologies, might deliver twice a year or might deliver once a quarter, whereas someone who is really good, and you hear like the old stories out of Netflix where they push to prod 15, 20 times a day, well, that shakes out to 200 times faster than 4 times a year or 6 times a year. So the math bears it out, and not every customer needs to push to prod 20 times a day. That shouldn't be your end goal unless it needs to be your end goal. But with that expertise, developing those skills, you fail less often and you recover faster when you do fail. It takes you shorter periods of time to deliver software. So that time from, okay, we've pushed the last bit of code that needs to be pushed, to actually getting it into prod, shortening that feedback loop saves thousands upon thousands of hours. So defining peak performance for you and then going at it relentlessly is really what we built Anthos to do, to give you that platform to drive that performance. And there is no way we're getting through all these slides, Ron, but there's a break point here in a little bit when we get there. Just as a heads up. So what is Anthos? I think I've said it 6 or 7 times. Anthos is taking the idea of Kubernetes as the deployment platform, as the application infrastructure, and building on top of that everything Google engineering thinks is required to build a scalable application platform and running it anywhere. That's what Anthos is. So the beating heart of Anthos is Kubernetes. And then on top of Anthos, or on top of Kubernetes, are a layer of things like service meshes and config management systems, serverless platforms, all of those things that we'll touch on briefly here in a minute, that can run pretty much anywhere. And we'll get into defining anywhere here in just a minute. But Anthos is our idea when we went to Google engineering and said, we need an application platform that runs anywhere. Anthos is what they came up with. So an end-to-end solution, what does that look like? And here's a whole bunch of squares we can take a look at. Anthos consists of the majority of these squares. And beginning with analyzing where you are, you can't go forward until you know where you're at. You can't go, you don't know where your direction is without an origin. Google Cloud Camp is that process I mentioned briefly of analyzing yourself against DORA metrics to figure out where you are on that spectrum and figure out how to move forward faster. And then Cloud Code and Cloud Migrate, getting your applications in. We have a full featured IDE built into Google Cloud out of the box, just like as part of Cloud Shell. It's called Cloud Code. Migrating applications into Anthos, there's an automated as well as a consulting driven process. Then once you get in there, cloud build, does it help you fulfill mission to run your own build servers? Or is maintaining a build server just an artifact of something that had to exist 20 years ago that doesn't need to exist now? Well, cloud build lets you make that decision. If it's not fulfilling your mission to have a build environment that you maintain and have to pay engineers and commit hours to, well, cloud build's fully managed service. You can incredibly configurable, incredibly powerful, and using that massive compute that Google has. Here before long, and the product that I'm helping build now, it's in private preview. It's called Cloud Deploy, which is the second half of that. So Cloud Build builds the applications, and then Cloud Deploy deploys them across multiple clusters. That will be added to this slide here when it goes into public preview in a month or so. Artifact registries, container registries, and then all of the different runtimes that are used. GKE is on Google Cloud. GKE is the Kubernetes flavor that we use. And we have on-prem deployments or on-premises or on AWS or on Azure iterations of GKE that are Anthos Kubernetes runtimes, but also Cloud Run, which is the serverless platform. On GCP, it's an in-house built system that's analogous to Knative, built to scale to millions and millions of users. If you deploy Anthos on VMware, it's built on top of Knative because it's going to have a smaller user count. Apigee is our API management system. And then hooking all of that into SRE ideals and SRE personas, cloud logging, cloud monitoring, cloud tracing, that gives you all of that functionality that you need to keep all of those things up and running and looking for the magic signals that give you the availability and the reliability that your applications need. Defining everywhere, where does Anthos run? Well, everywhere. And this slide, this bare metal and attached clusters, bare metal will run on bare metal, or will also run where there's sort of not vSphere inside on-prem infrastructure. So if you're using Nutanix or using another virtualization platform, or you're using bare metal servers, you can use Anthos bare metal to deploy there and get a supported experience. Attached clusters, you can actually attach OpenShift clusters or AKS or EKS clusters, or clusters that you've deployed with kubeadm or KOps. If it's a 1.17 release of Kubernetes, you can actually attach it to Anthos and get not a full experience where some of those control plane mechanisms don't work, but you can manage config security policies, and you can manage your configuration of the cluster using Anthos and give yourself a single pane of glass. A leader in multi-cloud, I think every slide deck that comes out of any marketing team has to have some sort of Forrester graphic on it. So this is fulfilling that requirement. We have a good, strong current offering. Everyone looked at it and everyone said it's a good offering. So we're not going to belittle this slide much longer. How does it get there? And I said a couple of minutes ago, we took this problem to Google engineering. And this is sort of the timeline of what was brought in to come up with Anthos, starting with Borg back in 2003, where, in that statistic where we schedule billions of containers per week, as of last year across all of Google's global environment, Google Cloud, as well as Google infrastructure. And then all of those things going along, ultimately in 2019, culminating in the release of Anthos, which is taking all of this knowledge and all of this experience and all of these lessons learned. And Anthos is the culmination of it. And it is miles away from being a perfect tool, but it's a tool that's designed to be iterated and improved upon. And there's some really, really cool features that I hope we've got time to get into, but we're running a little bit long. I'm looking for ways to trim this down. What does Anthos look like? Anthos platform components, app development, management console, ops teams, like we talked about briefly, policy management with ACM. Anthos service mesh is based on Istio, and it's supported and integrated, and there's a supportability matrix. A really cool feature that's coming down the pipe is the Anthos Connect Gateway, and it's in preview release now. It's going to be GA'd pretty soon. What the Connect Gateway lets you do is, no matter where those clusters are, if those clusters, or really what kind of clusters they are, whether they're on VMware or AWS, or they're an attached cluster of some other flavor, if it's registered to Anthos, you can connect to it. You can pull down a special kubectl or a kubectl config that will let you connect to it without having to have VPNs or bastion hosts or direct connects, or muck about with all sorts of DNS tricks to talk to the right endpoint, API endpoint. It all goes through the Connect Gateway and is managed through that connection that Anthos maintains to all the different clusters. And so it's really just a sort of a specialized kube config that works through the gateway. It's sort of an invisible proxy. But once you deploy the gateway, which takes about 5 minutes, you don't have to do anything beyond that point. You just, the kube config just connects through there and gets to the cluster that it needs to get to. Very simple feature. It's sort of chopping wood and carrying water, but incredibly valuable when you've got clusters stretched across 4 different platforms and you don't want to have to worry about maintaining the right connectivity or SSHing, proxying through the right bastion host. Can get really annoying and problematic. So one of the cooler features that's available now is Connect Gateway. Best-in-class Kubernetes, and I can back this up with facts. I can say that and consider it a factual statement. For a managed Kubernetes service, GKE is the best one out there. We get bigger than anyone. We get up to 15,000 nodes in a supported configuration, with companies doing that in production. And really what makes it demonstrably the best is what we do behind the scenes. The Google SRE team manages the control plane, and we apply all sorts of AI and ML to make sure your control planes are up and healthy and reliable and are doing what they're supposed to do. And then assist you in making sure that the pools of application nodes are doing what they're supposed to do. And of course, GPU and TPU stuff, we invented TensorFlow. Unique security features, eBPF, what we're calling data plane v2, if you're deploying GKE clusters, which is using Cilium and eBPF for the data plane. Really, really cool stuff. And one that didn't make it to this slide, but I wanted to plug real fast because it's a great feature, is called Workload Identity. Workload Identity is a tool where I can map reliably. I can run a pod in a Kubernetes cluster as a Kubernetes service account, and that pod is running with the privileges of a Google IAM service account, and I'm able to map those two programmatically to one another. So instead of having to do all sorts of weird stuff with permissions, I give the service account that I want my pod to run as the proper roles, being able to, for example, access Cloud SQL instances. And then when I'm launching it, I just run the pod as the proper Kubernetes service account, and the rest of it just works. I did an example for a customer a few weeks ago where I've using workload identity and using a feature of Cloud SQL called IAM authentication, where I'm able to authenticate using service accounts instead of the MySQL or PostgreSQL account names. I was able to go from creating the pod, deploying it to access, running a query against the database and showing it in a simple web app, showing the results with 0 stored credentials. And when you think about application, the worst thing in the world is accidentally uploading your service account key. It's a horrible, it's an annoying day to clean up on it in the best case. So being able to run end to end with full logging and full security without having to store any credentials or access any credentials in the pod, but using workload identity and using the stuff in Cloud SQL, incredibly good security feature. And we're bringing that idea of workload identity out to different Anthos clusters, and of course having to interface with different IAM systems. Single pane of glass, because you have to have one if you've got clusters running in different places. Not going to belittle that one. Cloud Run for Anthos. Again, we have a Knative based Cloud Run that runs on top of Anthos anywhere Anthos will go. Supports scale to 0, supports multiple protocols, all of the DNS stuff. So deploying a serverless platform on top of Anthos takes about 3 lines of config, and then it's up and running, and it's a fully functional implementation of Knative. GitOps at scale. This is another feature that I'm really bullish on. Anthos Config Management is GitOps at scale, because once you start putting clusters in multiple locations, keeping those clusters consistent is really hard, because we're not as an industry, we're not designed to think about clusters in Amazon the same way as we think about them in GCP, is the same way we think about them in VMware. But we have to, because there has to be a line of demarcation. Amazon and GCP and VMware, just to use those as the examples, are different. And ops teams have to absorb those differences. But once you get to the application, once you get to the developer experience and the application experience, it has to be the same for multi-cloud and hybrid cloud to work. And the way you get there is using a tool like Anthos Config Management, using GitOps to make sure the configurations of those Kubernetes clusters are as identical as they possibly can be, and then relying on Anthos as a tool to abstract away the differences. And yes, there has to be an ops team that understands how the different clouds work, that understands how the different platforms work. But once you get to the Anthos layer, once you get to Kubernetes, those differences have to go away. They have to be abstracted away for the application and the developer, or hybrid cloud and multi-cloud just don't work. So GitOps, Anthos Config Management, GitOps is a huge component of making that reality, where I can manage security policies and configurations of entire fleets of Anthos clusters with a single Git repo. It's an incredibly powerful tool. Zero trust networking. That's just sort of table stakes these days. You can't trust anyone. Like with the previous speaker talking about, one of the things he said, and it stuck with me, was, cyber attacks are the norm now. You can't trust anything coming in, and you can't trust anything, even if it's deployed and in the same cluster as you. And Anthos Service Mesh, built on top of Istio, is able to give us all the visibility we need to detect those issues with SLOs and logging and metrics, and then also in east-west encryption, zero trust, mutual TLS. So I can be as confident as is possible that the applications that are working in my network are the ones that are supposed to be there, and they haven't been corrupted. No system is perfect. We're working towards that hopefully somewhere, but Anthos Service Mesh is far down that road as is possible with today's technology. Operational efficiency, logging, monitoring, APM, which is tracing and using the tooling inside Anthos Config Management to trace connections all the way through, coming in the front door and bouncing through all the different services. Again, table stakes. You have to have this in a multi-cloud world. Your teams can't keep up without a tool like this that Anthos provides out of the box.
Hey, Jamie.
Yeah, and we're coming up. We have about what? We're right.
Like at least another 10, 12 minutes. I had there are a couple of questions, and I want to make sure we can ask these. You know, does Anthos support KVM? I want to.
Raw KVM or like Red Hat Virtualization KVM?
I'm not sure what Ernst is referring to. Maybe we can always, I'm just giving
they're probably going to be the same answer. We would support a KVM based installation, so like not using using like libvirtd. You would talk to your account team, and we would be able to figure out something using Anthos bare metal. Anthos bare metal, we call it bare metal because it's what it was designed against, but it really is this sort of catch-all. If we don't have an opinionated installer, bare metal is going to work. You can even use Anthos bare metal to stand up a cluster on top of VMs on GCP, which is something I do a lot for testing.
So Ernst from Citi will send you a separate email, put you in touch with Jamie, so we could get more specificity and get the question. I know.
Yeah, I know the Citi account team.
Yeah.
For Google, we can get you the right information.
Got it. And another question relates to, well, if there's no direct connect or VPN, then what is the bandwidth offering from Anthos when you want to deal with a multi-cloud API? Now, there are a lot of buzzwords and acronyms in that question that I'm not sure we're answering it directly. Maybe you could touch on just the bandwidth issue. And again, we'll set up a separate question. So
and that's anytime you talk about GKE Connect, which is the tool that an Anthos cluster uses to phone home to get that single control plane experience. That's the first thing that they talk about. It's the first question out of everybody's mouth, and the answer is not nearly as much as you think. We took that into account. If you have an application that generates mountains of logs, phoning those mountains of logs back to Anthos, unless that helps you fulfill your mission, isn't something that is going to help. And it's going to be a lot of bandwidth. But when you look at the way the logs are picked up and pushed out, and when you look at the way the state information is picked up and pushed out, I can't say that it's like 4K of continuous traffic per second, but it is significantly less than you think it would be because it's a continual stream and it is rate limited. So what the worst case scenario is, if you do have a giant backlog, is that you may see a handful of seconds before the log entries show up in cloud logging if you have a giant glut of logs that have to come through. I've only seen that happen with one customer with any kind of consistency, and they were using logging output essentially as the interface to an application and just dumping tons and tons of logs.
Okay, good. So we'll get some more of those questions.
Yeah, but we'll get in. Yeah. Send me a follow-up and we can talk about examples and specifics.
The final thing is, as you go through this, as you're describing all these very powerful features, if you can also tie in when individuals might already have some existing like Azure, AWS, maybe touch on some of the deployment architecture used. So if they like this solution and they've got something else, how do you make it coexist? And I think that's really the whole underlying strategy behind Anthos. And if you can just, offer some anecdotes on some customer examples you work with.
Yeah, so there are two terms inside Anthos that are kind of a decision tree, where there's an Anthos cluster and then there's an Anthos attached cluster. And there are different. So if you have a bunch of EKS clusters and you want to manage those EKS clusters along with Anthos on other locations, maybe in VMware or on GCP, you can take those EKS clusters and attach them. And it's the tool I mentioned briefly a minute ago, this thing called GKE Connect that runs as a pod inside a cluster and sends that data back into the Anthos APIs inside Google Cloud. All of that is fully supported and fully functional. You don't get all of the components because you're obviously deploying and controlling the life cycle of those clusters using Amazon's tooling or using Azure's tooling or using whatever process you've chosen to use to deploy those. But it works just fine, and customers use it all the time for sort of existing workloads or legacy workloads. OpenShift even works. An Anthos cluster, so for all of those, I mentioned Anthos Bare Metal a couple of minutes ago, we have installation methods for all of the different clusters, for all the different clouds. So there's a way to deploy an Anthos cluster on Amazon. And it's an opinionated process, and it's exactly what you think it is. It's a config file that looks like some YAML, and you specify some VPC IDs and you fill in some information, and it goes and deploys a cluster using a method designed by Google Engineering, and then automatically connects that back up to Anthos and sets it up. And what that does is it gives us, since we know exactly how it was deployed, we're able to control its entire life cycle. So you can create and tear down those clusters as part of an Anthos workflow. And then once you start getting in there, once that's there, Anthos is the life cycle and the control plane, the command and control for all these clusters. Once they're there, it's Kubernetes. So if you need to, if you're deploying Anthos on AWS so you can get a hold of an AWS service, well, the app just calls those libraries, and there's no differences there. Then it just becomes a Kubernetes app interacting with whatever service. The huge benefit of Anthos is that cluster is able to be controlled and managed in the same way as a cluster connected back, built and controlled on GCP that was put on GCP so it can interact easily with BigQuery to do data analysis and auto ML. And I don't have to, my ops team doesn't have to have its own workflow for AWS clusters and its own workflow for GCP clusters. Anthos gives us one workflow that provides a complete experience for both. That's how multi-cloud can be successful, because there's just too much information there for an ops team to be able to command and control any other way. Does that make sense, Ron?
Yes. The main thing I wanted to do was, as people, and we've only got a few minutes left, you can summarize some highlights to me. There's so many important things, and part of, I think, our mission at Angelbeat, everyone knows AWS and Azure are larger, but everyone needs to carefully understand all the tremendous skills that GCP is now offering. I mean, I know GCP, through acquisitions and staffing, has literally invested tens of billions of dollars in GCP. And so we think it's important that everyone make informed decisions as to what makes sense in your environment. And I just want to leave people with a sense that there are additional options out there, and that they know that they can make informed choices and still manage things effectively, even as they use different platforms.
Yeah, and I think that's the promise of multi-cloud at the end of the day. And we're confident enough that and again, we were a little late to the game getting to being a hyperscale provider, and there's been a feature gap that we're closing. The slide that's up now, the marketplace, inside GCP took a little while to get its legs under it, and bringing that in for Anthos is a huge step. So I can literally one click deploy applications from a GCP marketplace into a cluster running on AWS. And that's a completely seamless experience. But there is that perception that there's some feature gap. And again, like I said at the beginning, the Google Cloud is influenced by the experiences of Google, just as AWS's experience is influenced by the experiences of Amazon engineering. And that's a good thing, because we're going to excel at different things in different ways. And customers have multiple ways to think about workflows. And for customers that enjoy the way Google Cloud functions and the way you interact with the resources, well, Anthos is the way to take that experience and bring it into other places and to provide a single control plane.
Got it. And I think that's probably the most relevant thing, as we can summarize all these great customers. Yep. And maybe, you've got some good call to actions. That's the key takeaways, is that, GCP just needs to be understood. I don't know how much, if any, a feature gap currently exists, but we encourage everyone just to make informed choices. And just to do a quick level set, as I define hybrid cloud, which is what most people do, is you still have on-prem computing that needs to interact with your cloud computing. And multi-cloud is when you've got, it's basically when you're using GCP and or AWS and or Azure, and how do you manage that so you're not overwhelmed with a lot of complexity. And what you're seeing is that through tools like Kubernetes, open source, where you can literally run and move Kubernetes powered containers across hyperscale providers fairly easily. It's sort of like, literally, to make an analogy, it's just like taking a container off the train and attaching it to a truck to get delivered to a distribution center. I mean, that's really the logical origins of the word containers, is that you can move containers off different platforms, and you could do it when you're actually shipping physical goods, and you could also do it when you're moving digital assets.
Yeah, and that in a nutshell is where it is. And the top checkbox in this call to action slide is why hybrid cloud and multi-cloud are important, and why they're not just buzzwords, because they're kind of buzzwords. But you've got to put the application beside the data. And in an increasing number of use cases, that data isn't just the data, but it's the platform that analyzes the data. In GCP, which is the thing, that I know best, that is, you need to put your applications next to BigQuery and AutoML and all of the AI APIs that we have, because you don't want to have to pay to have the app running in Amazon and pay to make charges, to leave Amazon and go talk to Google, because we're the world leader in API and machine learning. So you need to put your application where it can do the most good, the fastest, and the most cost effective. And that's hybrid and multi-cloud. There are data sets that are never going to leave the data center, and that's okay. Your ops team still needs to be able to provide a consistent experience. And that's why Anthos works on VMware and bare metal servers. It's okay to have a data center. It's not a 4-letter word. It's maybe not the first thing you should think of, depending on the data set and depending on what the needs are. But put your app next to the data and put the data where it's best served, and then have an experience like Anthos on top of all of it. And that's the.
Hey, Jamie, we've got one other good question. I want to move over because we want to bring in Box Crypto to talk about the importance of encryption in multi-cloud. But Cliff did have a good question. How do you go about working if individuals have operations in China, as a case in point, where you literally have the Chinese firewall? How do you deal with situations like that? Is there any easy answer or not really?
I wish that I am dealing with that with a customer right now. Google's, in particular to Google, and I can't speak for Amazon or Azure or any other solution, Google does not operate inside the Great Firewall. And that's an ethical choice for lots and lots of reasons, in particular with some of the other products Google has. We have some points of presence at the edge of the firewall, and then there are some people who work inside China. There are some third-party vendors that can provide that integration, but it very quickly becomes a one-of-one discussion with what your needs are versus who can provide the inside the firewall components.